Avoidants don't regret losing you when you walk away. They regret it when they finally feel safe. That's the part most people misunderstand. When you left, there wasn't a dramatic collapse inside them. There wasn't instant sadness or longing. What their nervous system registered first was relief. Relief from expectation, relief from emotional demand, relief from the quiet pressure of being seen, needed, or required to respond consistently. Space felt like control, silence felt like peace. In that moment, your absence didn't feel like a loss. It felt like regulation. Avoidant attachment doesn't process loss in real time because loss itself isn't what triggers them. Intimacy does. While you were there, even when things were calm, their system stayed on alert. They weren't asking, do I love this person? They were asking, how long until I have to give more than I'm comfortable giving? So when you finally walked away, their body didn't interpret it as abandonment. It interpreted it as the end of a threat. No more expectations, no more emotional calibration, no more risk of being pulled too close. That's why regret doesn't show up at the goodbye. It doesn't show up in the silence right after. Regret doesn't live in the moment of separation at all. It waits. It waits until the nervous system settles, until the pressure is gone, until there's nothing left to push against. Only then does the mind start to wander back. Not because it wants closeness, but because it finally has the capacity to feel. Regret arrives later, quietly, when no one is asking them to show up anymore, when no one needs reassurance, when no one is waiting for a message or hoping for consistency. The external demands disappear, and with them goes the structure that kept their emotions suppressed. That's when the absence becomes loud, not dramatic, but persistent. It shows up in moments of calm, not crisis, in stillness, not chaos. Now, instead of reacting to you, they're left with you in memory, in contrast, in unanswered questions. The safety they wanted becomes too quiet. The space they crave starts to echo. And that's when the loss finally registers. Not as heartbreak, the way anxious partners feel it, but as a slow, unsettling awareness that something meaningful existed, and it's gone without asking for anything back. This is why avoidants often seem unaffected at first, then strangely reflective later. It's not manipulation, it's timing. Their system couldn't feel you while you were there. It was too busy defending itself. But once the defense is no longer needed, the emotional weight they postpone begins to surface. And by the time regret arrives, you're no longer in the room to receive it. You didn't matter most to them when you were there. You mattered most when you stopped needing them. That sounds backward. But for an avoidant nervous system, presence is manageable and absence is destabilizing. While you were in their life, they had tools to regulate themselves. Distance was one of them. When things felt too intimate, they could pull back. When emotions intensified, they could shut down. When closeness asked for more than they knew how to give, they could delay, distract, or disappear emotionally. Your presence gave them something to push against, and that tension actually helped them stay in control. As long as you were there, they could believe the relationship existed on their terms, even if they were inconsistent. Even if they were distant, there was still a sense of access. You were available enough to reassure them, not through words, but through your continued effort, your patience, your willingness to stay. That availability allowed them to avoid fully confronting what they felt. They didn't have to process loss, fear, or attachment because the system was still active. The connection was unfinished, unresolved, and therefore emotionally containable. But when you left and didn't chase, something fundamental changed. The usual defenses stopped working. There was no one to pull away from, no emotional thread to keep at arm's length, no proof that distance would bring you back closer. Your absence didn't create relief this time. It removed the structure they relied on to feel safe. And without that structure, control started to slip. Avoidants rely on tension more than they realize. The push-pull dynamic gives their nervous system something familiar to regulate against. When you're there and hoping, they can stay guarded. When you're there and waiting, they can stay detached. But when you're gone and no longer oriented toward them, that familiar tension disappears. And with it goes the illusion of control. There's nothing left to manage, delay, or suppress, only what's underneath. Now they're alone with unresolved emotion they never learned how to process. Feelings they once labeled as too much or overwhelming no longer have a person to project onto. They can't frame discomfort as your neediness or your expectations anymore. There's no relationship dynamic to blame. The discomfort becomes internal, and that's deeply unsettling for someone who has spent their life externalizing emotional pressure. Your absence forces a confrontation they were never prepared for, not with you, but with themselves. The questions they avoided begin to surface. Why does this feel heavier now? Why do I think about them more when they're not here? Why does the silence feel different than the space I asked for? These aren't romantic questions. They're regulatory ones. Their system is searching for the missing stabilizer and realizing it was you. This is why absence hits harder than presence for avoidance. Presence allowed avoidance. Absence removes it. When you were there, they could define closeness as optional. Now closeness is impossible. An impossibility is what finally triggers awareness. Not because they suddenly want intimacy, but because they no longer have the choice to avoid it. That's not freedom. Freedom would mean peace. Freedom would mean emotional neutrality. What they experience instead is confrontation with the cost of their patterns, with the emotional depth they couldn't access in the moment, and with the realization that the connection felt safer when it was unexamined than it does now that it's gone. Regret begins the first time they realize you're not waiting, not the day you left, not the day the relationship ended, and not even the first stretch of silence. For an avoidant, regret doesn't start with missing you in the way people usually imagine. It doesn't begin with longing or heartbreak. It begins with something far more destabilizing, the loss of access. The quiet understanding that you are no longer oriented toward them, and that the door they assumed would remain open has closed without announcement. At first, they tell themselves you're just taking space, that you'll resurface, that this is temporary. Avoidants rely on emotional ambiguity to stay regulated. As long as there's uncertainty, they can stay detached. As long as they believe you might still be waiting, they don't have to feel the weight of finality. So they don't panic immediately. They stay calm, rational, controlled. That's how they survive loss, by delaying its meaning. But then there's a moment, it's subtle, easy to miss from the outside. It doesn't look like desperation or a dramatic reach out. It looks like a pause, a hesitation, a flicker of internal alarm. The moment they sense you've emotionally moved on, your energy feels different. Less reactive, less available. Your silence doesn't feel strategic anymore. It feels complete. There's no tension in it, no pull, no invitation. That's when something shifts. Regret doesn't announce itself loudly in an avoidant nervous system. It creeps in quietly through the realization that they can no longer activate you. They can't provoke a response. They can't withdraw and expect you to lean forward. The familiar dynamic, the one that kept them feeling safe, stops working. And without that dynamic, their sense of control starts to erode. This is where panic flickers, but it's not the panic of wanting closeness. It's the panic of losing optionality. Avoidants don't feel secure through connection. They feel secure through choice, through knowing they could reach out if they wanted to, through believing you were still there in some emotional capacity, even if they never intended to use it. When that option disappears, the system reacts. They may not even consciously name it as regret. At first, it shows up as restlessness, as curiosity, as a sudden urge to check your presence online through mutual contacts, through indirect means. They're not looking for reassurance. They're looking for proof that access still exists. And when they don't find it, the absence lands differently. This is the moment regret quietly begins. Not because they suddenly want intimacy, but because finality removes their ability to avoid it on their terms. As long as you were waiting, they didn't have to decide. As long as you were emotionally available, they didn't have to confront what they felt or couldn't feel. Your waiting protected them from choice. Your moving on removes that protection. Now, instead of feeling pressured by closeness, they feel unsettled by its impossibility. The nervous system that once relaxed in distance now reacts to it. The silence they once requested starts to feel heavy, not because it's lonely, but because it confirms something irreversible. You're not just gone physically, you're gone relationally. And that's the core of avoidant regret. It's not rooted in romantic yearning. It's rooted in the realization that the connection no longer exists as a potential, and that the safety they derived from keeping it unfinished is gone. By the time they understand this, the regret is already active and you are already out of reach. They avoided the relationship, but now they can't escape the memory. That's one of the quiet paradoxes of avoidant attachment. While the relationship was alive, present, and asking something of them, their mind stayed focused on regulation, not reflection. They weren't emotionally cataloging what they had. They were managing what they felt they might lose. Their autonomy, their space, their sense of control. Avoidants don't grieve during the relationship because grieving would require emotional presence, and presence is exactly what their system is organized to avoid. Grief comes later. After it's over, after the pressure is gone, while you were there, their attention was fragmented. Every moment of closeness activated an internal calculation. How much do I need to give? How long can I stay engaged? When can I retreat? Even the good moments carried a kind of internal noise, an anticipatory stress about what would be required next. So instead of being absorbed in the experience of you, they were bracing against it. That bracing prevented emotional integration. Nothing fully landed. But once the relationship ends, that pressure disappears. There's no one waiting for a reply, no expectation to show up emotionally, no risk of being pulled into intimacy. And in that quiet, something shifts. The nervous system relaxes enough for memory to move forward. Now the mind starts replaying what it couldn't tolerate in real time. Not because it suddenly changed, but because it finally feels safe enough to look. This is when your consistency returns to them, not as something demanding, but as something steady. What once felt like pressure now feels grounding. Your emotional availability, which once activated their defenses, now registers as warmth, safety, a kind of presence that didn't require them to perform, only to receive something they didn't know how to do at the time. Your patience, especially, takes on a different meaning. While you were offering it, they may have experienced it as a silent expectation, as a clock ticking in the background. Now, removed from that context, it looks different. It looks generous. It looks rare. It looks like something they didn't appreciate, because appreciating it would have required vulnerability. This replay isn't nostalgic in the way people imagine. It's analytical, almost intrusive. Scenes surface uninvited. Moments they dismissed return with clarity, not because they want to relive the relationship, but because their mind is finally integrating what it avoided before. And integration always comes with contrast. What once felt overwhelming now feels irreplaceable, not because you changed, but because the threat is gone. Without the fear of being needed, your presence is reinterpreted. Without the obligation to respond, your emotional openness feels safe to observe. That contrast is where regret sharpens. The same qualities that triggered avoidance now highlight loss. This is also why avoidants often idealize partners after separation. It's not manipulation or selective memory, it's delayed processing. They are experiencing the relationship for the first time without the nervous system interference that distorted it. And by the time they see it clearly, they no longer have access to it. They replay not to punish themselves, but because their mind is trying to reconcile two realities: how it felt then and how it feels now. And in that reconciliation, a painful understanding emerges. What they pushed away wasn't actually too much. It was simply more than they knew how to hold. They're not just regretting losing you, they're realizing what they couldn't be. And that distinction matters because this kind of regret isn't romantic, it's existential. It doesn't ache because someone is gone. It aches because a version of themselves was never able to show up. For an avoidant, that realization cuts far deeper than missing a person. It exposes a limitation they've spent their life protecting themselves from seeing. Losing you hurts, but what unsettles them more is what your absence reveals. With distance and time, they begin to see the shape of what was offered to them, not as pressure or demand, but as capacity. Your ability to stay emotionally present, your willingness to invest, your consistency in moments where pulling away would have been easier. And alongside that awareness comes the recognition of what they couldn't receive without shutting down. They start to notice the gap, not between you and them, but between who they are and who they would have needed to be. What you held emotionally, they dropped. What you carried patiently, they deflected. What you made space for, they avoided. This isn't about blaming themselves in a dramatic way. It's quieter than that, more destabilizing. It's the sense that something meaningful passed through their life and they didn't have the internal structure to meet it. That realization threatens their self-image, which for avoidance is often built around autonomy, strength, and self-sufficiency. They see themselves as capable, independent, in control, but your presence and the way it eventually left challenges that identity because it suggests that independence alone wasn't enough. That control came at a cost. That emotional distance didn't protect them, it limited them. Avoidance can tolerate loss more easily than inadequacy. A loss can be rationalized, people leave, relationships end, timing was off, but inadequacy can't be dismissed so cleanly. It asks uncomfortable questions. Why couldn't I stay present? Why did closeness feel threatening? Why did I withdraw from something I later realized mattered? Those questions don't attack the relationship, they attack the self. This is why avoidant regret often turns inward. They may not reach out. They may not apologize. They may not even consciously label what they're feeling as regret. Instead, they feel a dull erosion of confidence, a quiet doubt about their capacity for intimacy, a growing awareness that the pattern wasn't just about you, it's followed them elsewhere too. And that's the most painful part. You become the reference point, not because you were perfect, but because you were real. You showed them a version of connection that required presence, not performance. And realizing they couldn't sustain, that doesn't just make them miss you, it makes them question themselves. Avoidants don't struggle with loss the most. They struggle with inadequacy, with a sense that when something genuine asked for engagement, they retreated instead of rising. And by the time they can see that clearly, the opportunity to be different with you has already passed. The deepest regret is the one they'll never confess. And that's often the hardest part to accept. Not that they don't feel it, but that you may never hear it spoken out loud. You may never receive the apology you deserve. You may never hear the words, "I messed this up," or "I couldn't show up the way you needed." Not because the awareness isn't there, but because admitting regret would require something far more threatening to an avoidant than loss itself: vulnerability. For someone with avoidant attachment, vulnerability isn't just uncomfortable, it feels unsafe. It challenges the core survival strategy they built early on. Stay self-contained, stay controlled, don't need too much, and don't let others see where it hurt. Regret, when acknowledged openly, cracks that armor. It exposes longing, it admits limitation, it places emotional truth in someone else's hands, and that's the very experience they've spent their life avoiding. So instead of confession, regret gets redirected. It finds safer outlets, it shows up sideways. You might notice them watching from a distance, checking your social media, lingering on your stories, tracking your milestones without engaging. That behavior isn't accidental. It's a way of staying connected without being seen, of soothing the ache without risking rejection or exposure. They can observe you without having to explain themselves or answer for the past. Sometimes regret surfaces through indirect inquiries. They ask mutual friends how you're doing. They bring your name up casually in conversation, not to open dialogue, but to gather reassurance that you still exist in a way that feels accessible. This allows them to feel a sense of proximity without confronting the reality that the relationship itself is gone. And then there are the unexpected reappearances. A message that feels out of context, a check-in that lacks depth, a casual "hey" after a long silence. These moments often confuse people because they seem to suggest interest without intention. And that's exactly what they are. Not attempts to repair or rebuild, but attempts to regulate, reaching out just enough to ease the discomfort without stepping fully into accountability. Avoidants don't suppress regret because they're indifferent. They suppress it because naming it would require them to sit in emotional exposure with another person. And that feels more dangerous than carrying the pain alone. So they keep it private, internal, contained, even when it weighs on them. This is why you can feel the regret without ever hearing it. You sense it in their timing, in their curiosity, in the way they hover at the edges of your life instead of stepping forward. They want relief, not loss, comfort, not confrontation. And understanding this isn't about excusing the behavior. It's about recognizing the limit. Their silence isn't proof that it didn't matter. It's proof that it mattered more than they knew how to hold and more than they were willing to risk admitting once it was gone. Regret destroys them, not because they lost you, but because they lost you after you stopped trying. That distinction is the final truth most people miss. The breakup wasn't the real ending. Distance alone didn't cause the regret. What broke something inside them was the moment they realized you were no longer fighting for the connection, no longer bending yourself to keep it alive, no longer orienting your emotional energy around their availability. That's when the loss became permanent. They didn't lose you in the argument, the silence, or the final conversation. They lost you when you outgrew the role of waiting, proving, and hoping, when you stopped explaining yourself, when you stopped accommodating their distance, when your nervous system finally chose rest over pursuit. That shift changes everything for an avoidant because it removes the dynamic they depended on to feel safe. As long as you were trying, they could stay exactly as they were. Your effort compensated for their absence. Your patience softened their withdrawal. Your hope filled the emotional gaps they didn't know how to bridge. They didn't have to change because the relationship kept functioning without them fully showing up. In that structure, they could remain detached without consequence. But the moment you stop trying, the structure collapsed. That's when regret takes its most destructive form, not as heartbreak, but as a realization. They begin to see that what they lost wasn't inevitable. It was earned through inaction. That if they had shown up even slightly earlier, if they had leaned in instead of pulling away, if they had met you halfway before you met yourself, the outcome might have been different. This kind of regret is uniquely painful because it isn't abstract, it's specific. It's tied to moments they remember choosing distance over connection, silence over expression, safety over risk, and now those choices can't be undone. You didn't leave impulsively. You evolved. And evolution doesn't reverse itself for someone who's already moved on. What haunts them isn't the idea of you with someone else. It's the awareness that you became unavailable, not out of anger, but out of growth, that you didn't harden, you healed, that you didn't withdraw to punish them, you withdrew to protect yourself. And that realization carries a different kind of weight. It means they didn't just lose a partner, they lost timing. Avoidants can live with rejection, they struggle with being too late, because being too late means acknowledging that the window was open, the invitation was real, and the opportunity passed not because of incompatibility, but because of fear. And fear is harder to justify once the outcome is clear. That's the regret they carry. Not that you left, but that they couldn't meet you before you did. Not that the relationship ended, but that it ended after you stopped needing them to choose you. By the time they understood what was at stake, you had already chosen yourself. And that truth lingers long after the connection is gone.